You might be making decisions in your business based on beliefs you don't even realize you have. And I'm not talking about obvious beliefs like, I believe I can succeed. I'm talking about the assumptions hiding underneath your behavior. So things like, I need more information before I act. If I don't know what the outcome will be, I can't take the risk. Or thirdly, this is just how business works. The problem is that once you've believed something for long enough, you stop experiencing it as a belief. You experience it as reality. And that's what I mean when I say you need to dehypnotize yourself from false beliefs, because your brain is constantly making interpretations about reality, and some of those interpretations become so familiar to you that you stop questioning them. And when a belief becomes invisible, it can control your decisions without you noticing it. Today I want to show you how to notice those beliefs, question them, and most importantly, replace them with something better. And that is evidence. So let's start with something important. A false belief isn't necessarily something that's obviously ridiculous. In fact, the most dangerous beliefs are often partially true. Let's say you believe I'm bad at sales. Maybe you had a few bad sales conversations. That's an observation. But I'm bad at sales is an interpretation. And then something interesting happens. You start behaving according to the interpretation. You avoid sales calls. You procrastinate when it comes to sales-related activities. You become scared of the emotion you would feel if things didn't go as you wanted them to. You don't follow up on very warm leads that you know could potentially become clients. And eventually your results seem to confirm the belief. See, I'm bad at sales. But what actually happened is that the belief influenced your behavior. Your behavior influenced the result, and then the result appeared to validate the belief. That's the loop. So you have experience, interpretation, belief, behavior, result, and then proof. And that loop can run for so many years without you ever consciously doing anything about it or noticing it. Think about something you learned when you were extremely young. That might be in your childhood, that might be in your teenage years. Maybe someone told you money is hard to make. Or maybe you heard something, don't take risks. Or potentially you learned something, that you need to have a secure job. Maybe you were praised for being intelligent and eventually you became afraid of looking stupid. Or maybe you experienced rejection. You tried something and it didn't work. And your brain created a story to explain what happened. That might be, I'm not good enough, people don't want what I have to offer, I'm not a natural entrepreneur, whatever that means. The important thing is that your brain doesn't need to consciously sit down and say, well, today I will create a limiting belief. It simply tries to make sense of what happens and what you can see. And repetitions makes those interpretations feel increasingly true because you see them as evidence. Imagine walking the same path through a forest every single day. Eventually, the path that you're walking will turn into a trail. Your brain works in the same way. The more often you think about something, the easier it becomes to think about it again. And eventually you don't even notice you're taking the path. You just walk it through the forest, obviously. That's what a belief can become. A mental path you follow automatically. So one of the first skills I want you to develop is learning to separate what happened from what you decided it meant. Let's say an investor says no. The observation is the investor rejected my pitch, but the interpretation might be my company isn't good enough. Or it might be I'm bad at pitching. Or investors don't understand my vision. Or lastly, it can be I'm never going to raise any money. Those are completely different things. One is an event where the investor says no. The others that I just told you are stories about the event that happened. Here's another example. You launch a product and you don't reach your goal of having a particular number of people that buys it. The observation is, my product isn't good enough. The interpretation might be, why would it ever become successful? But perhaps the problem was the positioning or the audience or the price or the distribution or the sales process or the messaging. One result doesn't automatically tell you which explanation is correct. Yet entrepreneurs often take one outcome and immediately turn it into an identity or a universal truth, which might be it didn't work, becomes I'm bad at this, the market doesn't want it, this business won't work, I'm not cut out for entrepreneurship. And now you are no longer responding to reality. You're responding to your interpretation of reality. I experienced this myself when I worked in sales. I had a belief that at the time felt really logical to me, and my belief was the more I speak, the more I can influence someone to buy. Makes sense, right? If you're in sales, you want to communicate the value. You want to explain the product. You want to handle objections. You want to persuade the person. So I talked and I talked and I talked. I was trying to give them more reasons to buy. But underneath all of that was an assumption I had in my head, which was my job is to lead them to their own conclusion. And I didn't really question it at the time. I thought that was what being good at sales meant, of me just talking and talking, explaining the product. Then I started looking at the process differently. I asked myself, what if my job isn't to convince them? What if my job is to understand them? What if I don't need to make them buy? And eventually I replaced the original belief with a completely different question. And the question I replaced the first belief with was, how can I have an honest conversation that leads them to make the best decision for themselves? That's a very different mindset compared to where I started. Notice that I didn't replace I need to convince them with I'm amazing at sales. I replaced the underlying objective from how do I get them to say yes to how do I help them make the best decision for themselves. And something interesting happened at the time. My closing rate went from 21% to 40% in 30 days. It changed in 1 month. Now, I'm not saying changing one sentence magically doubled the amount of sales that I was making. There are obviously many factors involved, but changing that belief changed the way I behaved because I listened differently after I changed that belief. I asked different questions. I became less attached to the outcome. I wasn't trying to push the person toward yes. I was trying to understand whether yes was actually the right decision for them. And ironically, becoming less focused on convincing people made me more effective at selling. That's just the fascinating part. Sometimes the belief that's supposed to help us achieve the result is actually getting in the way of the actual result. But here's where this gets even more interesting. If you had asked me back then, when my closing rate was significantly less than it was when I stopped, and if you had asked me this question, do you believe you should talk more to influence people? I would probably have said immediately, yes, obviously you have to. I didn't experience it as a belief. I experienced it as common sense. And that's exactly why beliefs can be so powerful, because you don't usually notice the belief. You notice the behavior, you notice yourself working harder, talking more, preparing more, avoiding something, trying to control an outcome. And you think to yourself in those situations, that's just who I am. But underneath those behaviors, talking more, preparing more, avoiding something, trying to control an outcome, well, Underneath that behavior is often an assumption that you're making yourself. So when you find yourself repeatedly doing something that isn't producing the result you want, don't immediately ask, how can I try harder? How can I do more? Ask yourself instead, what would I have to believe for this behavior to make perfect sense to me? That's a much more interesting question. And in order for you to actually change the beliefs that you currently have, here's a simple process you can use. The next time you're stuck, take the situation and perform what I call a belief audit. First, you have to find out, what do I actually believe? Don't make it vague, not something like my business isn't working. Instead, make it a bit more specific. It can be, I believe I need more employees before I can grow. Or I believe I can't charge more than XYZ. Or I believe I need to know exactly what I'm doing before I launch something. Get specific, because you can't question a belief you haven't clearly identified. Sorry to say, but you can't. Second, where did this belief come from? Figure out where you might have noticed this belief come in the first place. So it can be, who taught you this? Where have you perhaps learned it? Was it through your parents, in school, a previous employer, your industry, or a mentor, or a competitor? One particular painful experience? Or did you simply repeat the idea so many times that eventually it became true or obvious? This question is powerful because sometimes you discover, I don't actually know why I believe this. You just do. And here you can actually figure out, where did it start in the first place? And that's very important, because awareness is the first step of changing something. Because if you aren't aware, you can't change it. So thirdly, you need to ask yourself, what evidence supports the belief that I currently have? Now be fair, don't try to prove yourself wrong. Actually look for evidence that supports it. If you believe I need more funding before I can grow, what makes you think that's true? Maybe there are legitimate reasons. Maybe the business genuinely requires capital. Good, look at it honestly. Number 4, what evidence contradicts the belief? Now ask, is there anything happening in reality that doesn't fit this belief? Maybe someone else built a similar company without needing the funding. Maybe customers are already asking for the product. Maybe you're generating revenue but haven't optimized the offer. Maybe the belief is too absolute. And finally, the 5th one is going through, what experiment could test the belief? This is the part I think entrepreneurs should care most about, because you don't have to sit in a room for 6 hours trying to think your way into certainty, or just change your identity, or rewire or reprogram your subconscious. You can test things. If you believe people won't pay $5,000 for this, make the offer and figure out and see what the response will be. If you believe nobody will respond to cold outreach, well, send 50 thoughtful messages and you might see different results. If you believe I can't sell without being pushy, try having 10 conversations where your only objective is to understand whether the product genuinely fits the person's needs. Reality becomes your feedback mechanism. After you've done the belief audit, there is another trap I want you to avoid. You discover a limiting belief and you realize, I believe I'm bad at sales. And then you replace it, if I can speak, with I'm incredible at sales. Everyone wants to buy from me. Your brain doesn't believe you in that situation, and it shouldn't. You don't need to replace a negative belief with an unrealistic positive belief. Replace it with a more useful and testable belief. Instead of I'm bad at sales, try sales is a skill I can improve through embodiment, practice and feedback. Instead of, I need to know everything before I start. Try, I can learn some things faster by doing than by thinking. And the last one, instead of this will never work, try, I don't know if it will work yet. I need more evidence that my actions and behaviors align with the goal I have. But remember, in the time where you are looking for evidence, you will notice that your old identity and old behavior is trying to pull you back. So it's very important that you remember to make sure that every time you notice that old behavior, the old actions, the old identity getting increasingly more present in your day-to-day, think about and maybe just pause for a second and align yourself with the new identity you already know how acts. And then obviously do that instead. And the last one that I just mentioned is incredibly powerful, because sometimes the most dangerous belief isn't this will work, it's this won't work. Because both are predictions, but neither is reality. I think one of the most valuable skills an entrepreneur can develop is not confidence. It's the ability to update. You have a model of the world, you make a prediction, reality gives you information, gives you evidence of what you can see, but there is a time lag in terms of who you're acting as and the results that you actually see in reality. But then you can update your model from what you increasingly see more of in reality by operating from the new belief. And that's just entrepreneurship. You don't need to be right all the time. You need to become good at discovering when you're wrong. Because if your ego is attached to being right, you'll start protecting your beliefs. You'll ignore evidence, you'll blame the market, you'll blame customers, competitors, or the economy, even worse. Anything except the model in your head. But if you're willing to say, interesting, I thought X would happen, but Y happened instead. What does that teach me? You become incredibly difficult to stop, because every failure becomes information and feedback towards where you want to go and the new belief and the new identity. Every rejection becomes something that aligns with that new belief. And you're no longer asking, how do I prove that my belief is right? You're asking, what is reality trying to teach and show me? And one final distinction. The goal isn't to question absolutely everything. And the goal certainly isn't to become blindly optimistic. If the numbers don't work, the numbers simply don't work. And that's what you got to focus on. You can't just be optimistic in that situation and think, oh, the numbers will just work if I believe they will work. Well, there's probably a reason that they don't work in the first place. So you need to figure out why they are. And the numbers might work because you are taking different actions or different behaviors that doesn't produce the result that would get the result that you want in the first place. And then it's thinking, okay, what is the belief that I have that makes me want to do action or behavior? So if customers genuinely don't want your product, that's also important information. If a business model is fundamentally broken, you don't need to dehypnotize yourself into believing it will succeed. Sometimes a negative conclusion is the correct answer. The skill is being able to distinguish reality from your story about reality. You want to become someone who can hold a belief lightly enough to be able to test it as well and see if it actually is right or wrong. You can say, this is what I currently think is true, instead of this is the truth. That tiny distinction creates an enormous amount of freedom, because if you're wrong, you can simply change and it doesn't affect you in any way, because you are adaptable to the beliefs that you hold and you are you know that the adaptability is required, because right now you have certain beliefs that get you to do certain actions because of the interpretations you've made from those beliefs, and those actions will again give you a result. And if that isn't the result that you want, well, start by changing the beliefs, as we've gone through, and the belief audit, right? So when I say dehypnotize yourself from false beliefs, I'm not talking about some mystical process. Well, you could hear that it wasn't in the belief audit. It was very simple and straightforward, but I'm talking about waking up to the assumptions that have become invisible. The assumptions underneath your decisions, the assumptions underneath your behavior, the assumptions underneath your identity. Because maybe you don't need to work harder and just push. Maybe you need to question what you're actually working on. Maybe you don't need more confidence. Maybe you need to take the actions you're currently waiting to feel confident enough to take. Maybe you don't need to become better at convincing people if it comes to sales. Maybe you need to become better at understanding them, like I did. That was certainly true for me in sales, because I thought the more I speak, the more I can influence them to buy, as I said earlier. Then I questioned the belief and replaced it with, as I also said earlier, how can I have an honest conversation that leads them to make the best decision for themselves. And my closing rate went from 21% to 40%. Again, the number isn't the point. The point is what happened before the number. The belief changed in the first place, then the behavior changed, and the outcome changed. So the next time you're struggling with something in your business, don't immediately ask, what should I do? Just pause for a second and ask, what am I assuming is true here? Because the constraint you're trying to solve may not be outside of you. It may be a belief you're carrying in here without realizing it. And you don't need to believe everything your mind tells you. You don't need to reject everything your mind tells you either. You can investigate, test, observe, and you can update. And perhaps that's what real mental freedom actually looks like. Not having a mind that never produces false beliefs, because they will come, but having a mind that is willing to question them. Don't ask, how do I make myself believe something better? Ask, what is actually true, and how can I find out? Because the moment you become willing to question your own assumptions, you become much harder to control, including by yourself.